Why was Julius Caesar assassinated? Julius Caesar's assassination is one of the most dramatic events in world history. Movies, television shows, and even a Shakespearean play have used it in allusion or in fact to add drama to a story. But why was he assassinated? Who was involved? And was the assassination justified? Rome's historical background. To answer these questions, we will need to first discuss the history of the Roman Republic during this period, as well as the people involved. Rome during the last century BC was facing a crisis. This crisis was more due to its success than its failures. Rome had rapidly expanded since the end of the Second Punic War in the 200s BC. This expansion mostly benefited the wealthy senatorial class of Romans who used their newfound wealth and power to claim even more land while the poorer soldiers were out fighting the wars that expanded Rome. These soldiers came back to a Rome that didn't even need them as laborers, because of the slaves they brought back from their conquest. This led to an influx of poor and landless Romans flooding into the urban centers, especially Rome. Reform was desperately needed, but the government had become dominated by wealthy elites and the Senate that had no intention of allowing such reform. They even squashed any attempt of land reform from the lower class aligned tribune by assassinating two of its leaders, the Gracchi brothers. Decades after the death of the second Gracchi brother, two Roman generals, Gaius Marius and Lucius Sulla, would fight a civil war over control of the army and the city of Rome starting in 83 BC, all while Caesar was still young. This civil war led to the professionalization of the army as both sides hired and equipped private armies to fight each other and paid them with plunder. After Sulla won, he made himself dictator and attempted to fix Rome's political problems by reforming the government. He did not, however, fix any of the economic causes for the strife. At this point, Rome had had armies that were more loyal to their generals than the Republic and precedent for such generals seizing power with such armies. What Julius Caesar did. This is where Julius Caesar comes in. Caesar was one of Rome's most successful and, after capturing Gaul, richest generals. Gaul was where modern France is today. He came into Rome with an army after his enemies got him declared an enemy of the state. Caesar, like Sulla and Marius before him, took over the government and established himself as dictator. Dictator in ancient Rome was an emergency position that granted the holder absolute power. It was usually only held for a year, but Sulla held it for 7. Caesar granted himself the position for life and made himself a tribune at the same time. At this point, there were fears from the senatorial class that he had made himself a king in all but name. They also feared that he would go that extra step and name himself king. Rome hadn't had a king in over 600 years at this point, and the thought of having one horrified much of Rome. The motivation. Thanks to Shakespeare's play, most people are familiar with Brutus and Crassus. In the play, Brutus was motivated by simple republican virtue while Crassus was motivated by his own ambition. Though it is impossible to be sure of the motivations of people who died thousands of years ago, the reality is probably much more complicated. Remember, both Crassus and Brutus were members of the same Senate that used assassination to keep power from the Gracchi brothers and played a part in the purges and counter-purges of Marius and Sulla. They were just as interested in staying in power as protecting the Republic. Caesar's own motivation is also hotly debated. Some sources state that Caesar had little choice as his enemies in the Senate had conspired to trump up charges against him. While others doubt the possibility that he would have been convicted and that Caesar just used those charges to appear as the aggrieved party for his already planned takeover. Caesar's plans to reform Rome are also contentious. Was he a revolutionary trying to reform Rome, or just trying to take it over? He did focus somewhat on poor relief, but it was far from some proletariat revolution. He didn't redistribute the senators' land, but he did give out land conquered from Gaul to his soldiers. The assassination and its effects. After the death of the leader of the Senate's armies, Pompey, Caesar had no one in Rome that could openly resist him. So, his enemies in the Senate decided to kill him to end his reign once and for all. So, on March 15, 44 BC, Julius Caesar was assassinated on the floor of the Senate by multiple senators wielding daggers. These senators included the aforementioned Cassius and Brutus. Though the senators expected to be treated as heroes, an angry mob would force many of them from the city. At this point, the Second Triumvirate, composed of Mark Antony, Octavian, later to be known as Caesar Augustus, and Marcus Lepidus, formed. They would end up defeating the Senate's army and fighting each other until only Octavian remained in power. Conclusion. Whether you consider the final conflicts between the Second Triumvirate and the Senate to be a last stand for republican freedom or the last gasp of a brutal oligarchy, there is no doubt what its results were. With the rise of Caesar Augustus to undisputed power, the Roman Republic was dead, and the Roman Empire was born. The Senate's last-ditch effort to save the Republic from tyranny ironically doomed the Republic they were trying to save. Cassius and Brutus, themselves, would end up taking their own lives after the Battle of Philippi to avoid being captured by the Second Triumvirate. They likely saw themselves as failures who doomed their beloved Republic. Now, tell me what you think in the comments. Do you think the Senate was justified in killing Julius Caesar even though they didn't get the result they were after? Or do you think that the ends failed to justify the means?